Hello ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be covering 3 games of the Jobava London which were played against opponents who were all above 2000 rating. The goal of this video is to teach you guys different attacking strategies as well as middle game opportunities in the Jobava London that you may not have previously known. Of course, if you're not familiar with the Jobava London, feel free to check out my Jobava London playlist. It's all on my YouTube channel and covers almost everything you need to know. Now, our first game is against a guy who was 2053 rated. We start with the Jobava London. Would be weird if it was any other way. And right off the bat, we see somewhat of an inaccuracy with knight c6. Now, typically when we see knight c6, it kind of invites the idea of playing knight b5. So if my opponent was to play something like knight f6, we would 100% just go knight b5 here. And then go through something like this, where white is just up 2 pawns. I guess 3 pawns for the moment until black recaptures. But, you know, that's kind of far-fetched. And instead of playing knight f6 and losing the game on the spot, my opponent just plays a6. Basically, the reason that knight c6 is bad, even with a6, is that the c-pawn is now blocked by this knight. This knight ends up being a slight nuisance in the position because black is no longer able to play either c6 or c5, which are very, very important pawn breakthroughs in any d4 opening. So whenever you see d4, if you're playing black, don't really commit to knight c6 early unless you're playing a super specific line. Like, there's very few exceptions to this rule. But anyway, e3, knight f6, knight f3, and now we get the second interesting move, which is bishop g4. This move is pretty uncommon, but when it does happen, which will be like maybe 5% of your games in the Jobava London, it's important to know how to play against it because a lot of people misplay this position and end up wasting a potentially very good advantage. And here you just want to play h3, and the point being, if black chooses to capture this knight on f3, you recapture the queen, you have a slightly more active position, you're doing pretty good. You're going to develop normally. I mean, you might play g4 and g5 if you're really feeling like it, but, you know, it's nothing special. Now, the cool thing about this position is that for whatever reason, black almost always chooses to misplay this position and not take the knight. I guess bringing out the bishop to g4 does not imply that black wants to trade, but it simply wants to pin the piece. And I always see bishop h5 in these positions, which to me is pretty strange because I know what's going on and that I want to play g4. But a lot of your opponents will not expect a move like g4, and they will naturally bring this bishop back to h5. So here you will immediately punish them with g4, sending this bishop to g6. You got to already consider the amount of moves that black has wasted with bishop g4, h5, and g6. And the onslaught will essentially continue. We go knight e5 here with the idea of playing h4 and h5 in the near future. And here my opponent chose to trade off the knight, which I thought it was a normal move. But in reality, this posed a lot of problems for black in that this d5 pawn is now hanging in no matter what black does. And here I was expecting knight e4 in a slightly more complicated position, but instead my opponent played knight d7. And I'll be completely honest, guys, I have zero idea as to why I did not simply capture this d5 pawn right now with the queen. I played h4 basically automatically, but to be completely honest, it doesn't really make much of a difference. Even if my opponent tried to protect this pawn on d5 with something like e6, a simple h5 would trap the bishop, and, you know, we would be up an entire piece. Bishop e4, f3. We would just be up a bishop and completely winning the game. And my opponent played h6 here because he needed a retreating square for the bishop. I played h5, bishop h7, and right now, I absolutely cannot tell you why I didn't play queen takes d5. This is definitely a great move to play, a very simple move. Queen takes d5. You're attacking b7. The reason queen takes d5 is better than knight takes d5 is for the sole purpose of attacking b7, but also, I guess it wouldn't be sole purpose then. So the multi-purpose move of queen takes d5 is that if something like c6 was to occur, you go to d2, and now you can castle long next. And of course, if you started by taking the knight, then got hit with c6, knight c3, the queen would not be on d2, it would be on d1, and you would need to spend another move before you could castle. Anyway, here we also had e6. Yeah, we had e6, and we missed this move. But the point is, after f takes e6, you can play bishop d3, and now you're attacking this weak g6 square. For example, if the opponent was to trade the bishops, queen g6 would be checkmate. So knight f6, opening up the square to d7, and then after you long castle, like literally, you're just completely winning. This king is way too weak, and you have, you know, various pawn breaks in the position. The cool thing is that none of this happened, and I just played bishop d3, which is just an objectively not very good move. I mean, there's a free pawn right in front of me. Like I said, I don't really know why I didn't take this. I think I was playing this game at 3 a.m., and I guess this should go to say that the quality of these games isn't going to be super high, which in a way makes it more instructive because we get to explore a bunch of different lines that otherwise would not have really been as possible or intuitive. Yeah, queen takes d3, knight c5. My opponent decides to blunder the pawn anyway. What a nice guy. Queen takes, knight takes. And from here, we're up a pawn. And the rest of this game doesn't really matter as much. The main thing I wanted to show you guys was that if your opponent was to ever play bishop g4, you just play h3, and you're able to kick the bishop out and basically get a large advantage if your opponent doesn't take the knight. Because g4 is a very unexpected move in a lot of cases, your opponent might not expect it because it's unexpected. I mean, I feel like I'm just repeating myself here for no reason. But in essence, you get a good position. Now, if we go to the endgame, how do we actually convert this position? Because yes, we're up a pawn, but this bishop is stuck behind e5, which is a very, very common theme in the Jobava London. If you recapture the pawn, your bishop on f4 is going to be pretty bad for most of the endgame until you're able to free it with a move such as g5. This is another benefit of having pushed these pawns so early, is that a singular move can, open up the g file completely and help this bishop escape. But yeah, we have a bunch of trades happen here. I had to be very careful so as to not get checkmated. And basically, after all of these trades, it's same color bishops where I'm up a pawn, but I have two doubled pairs of pawns. Nice thing in this position is that my opponent doesn't really have any way of capitalizing on these doubled pawns and this weakness. So we just kind of push her pieces. And here, I actually missed a move. This is a hard move to spot, but here you have bishop f6, which is pretty ridiculous if you think about it. The point is, if g takes f6, you can actually just play h6, and your opponent has no way of actually stopping your promotion. And of course, if the capture doesn't occur, you'll simply take the pawn, or g6 or something, you just play h6 anyway. So regardless, white ends up promoting and winning. But bishop f6 is a hard move to spot because you just don't really think about throwing your bishop up in front of a pawn. My idea was to eventually force the king down here and then play something like bishop e7, bishop f8, take the pawn, and then push our pawn to promotion. A couple of moves later, the king is now on c6. The king no longer protects this e7 square. And so after king c4, and by the way, I could have started with bishop e7. It didn't really matter. There's no like super forced line here. White is just winning regardless. But yeah, bishop e7, bishop f8, and my opponent resigns. So pretty cool first game. There's a lot of instructive moments here, as we already talked about in the opening with bishop g4. But even more importantly, I would say how to play with this bishop when there's a pawn on e5. And the answer to that is you really only have one option, and it's to play g5 at some point and open up the king side. I guess sometimes you can play e4 and drop the bishop back, but then the e5 pawn becomes vulnerable. So most of the time, you just have to look for these g5 pawn breaks, which are integral to the Jobava London anyway. So it's not something that, should be super shocking for you, and it should align with most of your plans anyway. Now, moving on to our second game was against a guy who was 21-40. I think he was 21-51 actually before the game. He ended up losing 11 rating points, so he's 21-40 now. But basically, we started out with the Jobava London, and my opponent played bishop f5. And whenever you see bishop f5, you should, jump up and start celebrating right away, because it doesn't mean you're going to win or anything, but it means you're going to get a very comfortable position. The bishop on f5 becomes a target that we're going to harass for basically the entire middle game. Bishop f4, e6, e3, normal stuff. Now, bishop d6 here is a slightly annoying move because ideally you would want to keep the bishop on the board just for extra activity and more attacking potential. However, that's not really possible when bishop d6 is played. If we had a knight on f3, we would just jump into e5, but we don't have a knight on f3. And so here you just kind of have to accept that this bishop is going to get traded off. You're going to have doubled f-pawns. But there's a lot of compensation that comes from that, actually. And, it's not even a bad thing at all. It's just that I prefer to keep this bishop on the board, but that's totally up to personal preference. I played knight f3 here because any alternative, such as bishop g5, is just outright stupid. I mean, I would lose the bishop to g5, so I actually don't have any alternatives other than bishop g3, which still trades the bishop off. I just waste the tempo. But yeah, take stakes, knight f6, knight e5. And the reason we play knight e5 after we see knight f6 is for a few reasons. We're going to play g4, and we want to kick this bishop out and harass it. As I've previously mentioned, this bishop on f5 becomes a very big target. And the knight on e5 supports this g4 square, so in a weird way, we're both developing the knight and also setting up g4. Castles, g4. And when I saw castles, I realized that my opponent wasn't very familiar with the Jobava London, because you never want a castle in this position where g4 is so readily available. Especially since we haven't committed our king to the king side yet. In this position, we're definitely going to be castling queen side. Yeah, bishop e4, f3, and then h4. And we just have a very large kind of pawn storm that we're launching on our opponent's king side. h5 here, because otherwise h5 would be from us. And if my opponent played h6, it would have been a lot worse than h5, because after our own h5, bishop h7, we just have g5, completely opening up the king side and then playing something like rook g1, queen g4, or whatever. Basically, would be checkmating black in a matter of moves. But since my opponent is a pretty good player, he acknowledges this and plays h5. And here I make a mistake. I played g5, which I thought was a good move because it forced knight to d7. E4 and g4 are both blocked by this f3 pawn. And I thought that this resulting position was very, very good for white, which was a big miscalculation on my part. Even though both of these pawns are very weak, we also have 3 weak pawns. And, if black plays accurately, black will be able to defend this position and likely play into a draw, despite how weirdly imbalanced it looks, this is a very drawish position because both sides can't really make any progress with accurate defense. Anyway, what I was supposed to do was play queen e2 and then slowly develop something like bishop h3 and then eventually play f5. This is the big idea, to play f5, send this bishop back, trade off these pawns, and open up the g file. That way we can play rook g1, queen g2, and basically play super aggressively and just attack the enemy king. Now, I didn't do any of that, but this is very much worth noting. You want to play queen e2, and it's not like queen e2 is the only move it's forced or something. It's not. You can play queen d2, that's fine as well. But queen e2 has a little bit more prowess to it because it supports this knight on e5, and it inadvertently targets this e6 pawn. So bishop h3, f5, all of these things kind of line up on this diagonal, attacking this e6 pawn and everything behind it as well. So queen e2 just adds a little bit more fire to the attack, if that makes sense. I played g5. My opponent went 97. We traded, and I thought, yeah, this is pretty good. Both of these pawns are weak, but here I thought I was winning. I was completely wrong. Like I said, if my opponent played this completely accurately, this would have been a very easy draw to hold for either side. I played bishop h3 here. The point is that if my opponent chooses to take on f4 for whatever reason, bishop takes e6, king h7, knight takes d5. This rook is under attack. We win an extra pawn. After the rook goes back, we can actually play f4. The nice thing about f4 is that this king is extremely weak, and let me show you guys an example. Point being is that if c6 was to occur and this knight was being attacked, you could actually just out-tempo your opponent, play f5, and the idea is that if this knight gets captured, you take on g6, king takes, queen d3. The only move that black has is a forced move, it's forced mate, is rook f5, delaying the inevitable by a singular move. Queen takes f5, and it's checkmate. And of course, if the knight doesn't get captured in something like, g takes f5, you just have queen h5 check, checkmate. So yeah, queen h5, mate, pretty cool. But yeah, essentially that is how that would go. So f4 is not a pawn that is very easily capturable right now. But my opponent played queen e7, bringing a piece to the attack. I played queen e2. The reason I played queen e2 was both to attack e6, and to prepare knight takes d5. My arrows are not on point today, but knight takes d5 would be a great move if possible because the queen is pinned to the pawn. So that essentially was my goal. Now, my opponent here played rook takes f4 and just absolutely lost the game after, like I said, knight takes d5. We're attacking both the queen and rook now. So it's more than just a nice little tactic where we win a pawn because of a pin. We actually win a very crucial exchange in this position. Queen d6, knight takes f4, queen takes e6, and then queen e4. And the rest of the game didn't matter. We just traded pieces and we won the game. I'll show it to you guys anyway, but first I want to talk about a kind of more crucial way of playing for my opponent and how he could have played this extremely well. So the only real way for my opponent to save either of these pawns is to play rook e8. Obviously, we cannot take this pawn now, and knight takes d5 doesn't work because the queen is protected by the rook. So this would have been just completely stupid. We would have lost the knight for no reason. And after something like queen e8, white doesn't really have a lot of tactics here. Like I can castle, okay, knight c6, rook e1, we're attacking this, but knight f8, everything is defended. So this position is just equal. There's absolutely nothing here for either side. You can just shuffle pieces and agree to a draw, and it's really, really boring. But I guess like king b1 maybe, or queen b5 to be super aggressive. Black accrues a small advantage here, so not worth it. And essentially the reason I'm telling you guys all of this is because I made a mistake by playing a, kind of preemptive, premature g5, where I should have just played queen e2, long castled, and then prepared f5, which would have been a much more aggressive move rather than g5. And because I missed this, if my opponent was a little bit more accurate, he would have been able to comfortably secure a draw in this position. But anyway, rook takes f4. We've already been through this. I try to trade queens with him because that's what I'm supposed to do when I'm up material. I think he blundered a piece here. And then I force a trade because the queen has literally 0 other squares. My opponent plays a couple of more moves and then resigns. So pretty good win. There were a lot of things that I can improve on. And I think that it was very, very useful to show you guys. Because from the perspective of someone who looks at this position for the first time, they can consider white could be considerably better because of these two weak pawns and the fact that the rook has to go to e8 to protect e6. But as it turns out, that's really not the case since white literally has 0 ways of making any progress in the position, which is unfortunate, but it is the truth. That's why the main instructive moment of this game was this g5 move. And instead of playing it, I should have played queen e2 or queen d2. Didn't really matter too much, but you guys remember the idea. Bishop h3 and then f5. Open up the g file, and then we can attack along the g file, which is one of the more difficult attacks to stop for black in the Jobava London. Our last game here is against a 2018 opponent. I played this one a little while ago, but it's still just as relevant. My opponent plays a6 here. Very common move, just preparing knight b5 in general, which I'm completely fine with. I actually don't like knight b5 lines for the most part. because I feel like they lead to pretty boring positions after something like knight a6, or even sometimes ideas like bishop d6 can be just kind of boring, which is why I typically prefer to keep this knight on c3 anyway. So a6 is a move that I'm always comfortable to see because like I wasn't gonna go to b5 anyway, bro. E3, bishop f5, and again, when you see the bishop on f5, you should have a smile on your face because this means that this bishop will be getting harassed. Knight f3, and then he plays h6. And that is basically the main reason I'm showing you guys this game. Well, there's multiple reasons, but one of them is this h6 move, which is pretty kind of uncommon, but it is a good move that you should know how to play against. And here I like to play h4. I like to be aggressive right away. The point is that we're going to go 95 and then g4 next, and then we're going to prepare g5. Then we're going to want to open up the position, and well, we'll see from there. But yeah, the best move, by the way, according to the engine, is something like h3 or bishop d3, but like that's what the engine says. What the engine says doesn't actually matter in terms of, you know, small advantages, because it'll just play the objectively best move. But when you're playing against a human, it actually doesn't matter, and playing the more aggressive style will typically lead to actually much better results. So I played h4 here, e6, 95, we're preparing g4. And as you can see, black has to waste another move by moving the bishop again. Here we play g5, hg, hg. And as you can see here, we put our opponent in a very uncomfortable position, which is exactly what we wanted. Now here, our opponent has a sneaky move with bishop takes c2. You should just take this rook, give up the queen. It's not a big deal, because now you take on f6. If knight takes f6 or something like that, rook takes d1, you're going to be doing pretty good for yourself. I mean, you're going to get a rook and 2 minor pieces for a queen. That's a good trade-off. But if you really don't want to trade queens, you can just give up the exchange. And after rook takes h1, and g takes f6, you're still going to be up, you know, 2 pieces for a rook. So you're not really giving up an exchange in any way, shape, or form. I sort of misspoke in that in a sense. Very good position regardless of how you put it. Why it's going to be okay both ways. Now, my opponent did not spot this idea, and instead, he played knight takes e5, which was a very poor move to play. Because after d takes e5, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4 isn't possible because black will lose the rook here. So d takes e4 is a must, and here all we have to do is play bishop g2. And then we're going to take this pawn, and this bishop is going to be in a lot of trouble. So for example, queen takes, rook takes, you know, bishop c5, whatever. This pawn is unprotectable. f5 is not possible because of en passant. But even if it was possible, g6, right? The opponent cannot take because then he will lose the rook. So this will be completely winning, and, you know, black could resign here. None of this happened, though. If bishop c5 was to occur, bishop takes e4, like I already mentioned. Taking this is not possible. I guess it is, but black ends up losing an exchange and then a rook, so a rook in an exchange. Weirdly unnecessary elaboration on my part. I apologize for that. Let me take a sip of water. Anyway, moving on further. This is what should have happened, right? Bishop g2, and we would have been completely winning. Unfortunately, I was blinded by my own ambition, and I played queen g4 here with the idea of, you know, pushing g6 and being aggressive and just doing random bullshit. I missed the very obvious bishop f5, which my opponent very easily spotted. And the problem with bishop f5 is now the rooks see each other. I don't have any more advantages. In fact, I'm just arguably, not even arguably, I'm objectively worse here. So I have to go queen g2 to save this rook. We trade, queen d5, rook d1. And this is the kind of beginning of the more instructive portion of this game. And it's that, how much do we value these 3 pawns? And in these sort of situations where we have some sort of activity in the middle and we have an open king side where we can either attack the king that's been castled or is yet to castle, we don't care about the queenside pawns at all. He can take all of them in one clean swoop, and in that time, I'll spend all of it developing my pieces and attacking. So he takes on a2. I go to h3. The point of that is to trade this bishop off, which is what happens. And he takes on b2. And right off the bat, this is already a bad move. As you can see, I mean, the engine immediately goes back to almost equal. Reason being, we have g6, which is such a nice move, because if the opponent takes, you have queen takes e6, bishop e7, and then just bishop g5. And this is very, very hard to defend. Queen b4, you have to go... I mean, you can even go c3 here, which is pretty funny. Queen takes c3, and then you go to, you know, king f1. Because if queen b4, then you could go to g2 to avoid any checks, and then you're going to play rook d7 next. And of course, a move such as rook d8 just doesn't work. You have queen g8 check, has to be blocked by the bishop, and then you have rook takes d8 checkmate, which is a pretty beautiful checkmate. But essentially, that is what you can do in this position, g6. Of course, the opponent doesn't play f takes g6 because that would be an obvious loss, since the capture of e6 basically guarantees white's victory here. And my opponent plays queen b4 check. And at this point, I'm glad I moved the bishop out to h3. It was another benefit to bring the bishop out, because now I can freely move my king to f1 and run him away as far as I need to. After king f1, my opponent played queen c4, king g2, and then he take the pawn, which I thought was strange since we just went over why taking this pawn is a terrible idea. And he clearly knew it was a terrible idea too, since he didn't immediately take it. I guess the justification here was that the pawn on e6 is protected by the queen. But that is not a good justification, because this queen can get kicked out at some point, and there are no pawns that could ever protect this pawn. So here, I played the move queen g4 again for a second time. And before we talk about queen g4, the best move in the position is queen h7. And what queen h7 does is essentially the same idea as queen g4. We're attacking g6, but it is able to do a little bit more than that. So for example, king f7, protecting g6, right? We go rook d7, okay, bishop e7. Now you have bishop g5. So the bishop cannot take because of the pin. Black could try to play something like rook e8. And the reason, finally, we get to see the reason for queen h7 is that you can play bishop f6. And this is a beautiful move, because neither the bishop nor the g-pawn can take this bishop, since both are pinned to the king. And now we're threatening just checkmate by taking on g7. Black has to respond by playing rook g8. And then we take this bishop for free. And we're guaranteed a win very, very soon. Like queen g6, I mean, we're going to f7. It's unstoppable. You win the game. Now, my move queen g4, while still being a good move, does not have the same amount of aggressiveness that queen h7 does. But it's fine, because we're still going to be winning here. If the opponent played king f7, we would go basically through the exact same line with rook d7, bishop e7, and then bishop g5. Except now, after rook e8, I don't have any way of forcing the rook away from the protection of the bishop, the g8, since my queen is now on h7 and on g4. And the best I can do is to simply play queen f4, kick the king out, and then win a piece. Which, by the way, is more than enough in this position. Even though black is up 3 pawns, you're going to be up literally any of these 5 pawns or 6 pawns very, very soon. And you're going to be alright. So something like queen takes c2 just simply doesn't work. You have queen f8, checking h7, bishop f6. The cool thing about this is that if your opponent takes this bishop, you retake back with a pawn, and now queen g7 checkmate is unstoppable. So white would definitely be winning in this position. But my opponent played something a little bit different. He did not play king f7, and he played bishop e7, which to me was completely ridiculous. And this just enables the capture of g6, which is exactly what happened. As you can see, it's a nice forced move. The d-file is completely cut off. The only available move is king f8. And now the light square diagonal completely blocks the king from escaping. And this kind of forces me to acknowledge that if I had this rook on d1 on h8, this would be checkmate. So I played the very logical prequel to that idea, which is rook h1, preparing rook h8. And my opponent resigns here. Could my opponent have tried something else? 100%. He could have played king g8. And here we have multiple moves. I mean, we have bishop h6, we have rook h7. Rook h7 is the most straightforward one. And if something like bishop f8 stopping us from taking this g7 pawn, we can just play queen h5 and prepare rook h8. And at this point, it's unstoppable, and black gets checkmated. So once again, a very instructive game. There were some mistakes made, but this rook h1 idea was very nice. And it all stemmed from a misunderstanding of which pawns my opponent is allowed to capture here. So I know that these 3 pawns don't mean anything to me in this sort of position where I'm objectively worse. The only thing I have is my counterplay. But my opponent thought that it was just an easy way for him to get more material and gain some sort of advantage, which was his mistake. If he played after queen takes a2, bishop h3, takes, something like rook d8, I actually would not have had anything. There's just nothing in this position. Like, I trade, then what? What, g6? What happens here, you know? Like, he just goes queen b1, and after king e2, queen takes c2, and I'm cooked. It's just, it would have been unfortunate. So, you know, queen f1, queen d1, king g2, oh, queen f3, we force a trade, and I'm down an entire pawn, and, well, 2 pawns with the same color bishops. So, this endgame would have been completely devastating for white, but, like I said, my opponent was just simply not aware of this, and thankfully we're able to get away with it. So, this kind of goes to show a few ideas. If you're ever in a position where you're slightly worse or a lot worse as white in the Jobava London, but you have some control over the center and some control over the king side, forget the queen side pawns, give them away as many as you need, and simply focus on attacking, and you might just come out on top. Now, guys, this covers everything I wanted to show you in this video. I really hope you all found it useful, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing. Helps my channel out a ton, and I would really appreciate it. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Goodbye.